Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Tech Tuesday. My name is Vanessa, and today we're going to be talking about Vertex AI with Evan Scholl, who's our Associate Director of Research Informatics Data Science Services. Before we get started, I just wanted to let everyone know we are expecting quite a few people to log in. So I do have your mics muted to prevent any distracting background noises. But if you have any questions at any point in today's session, please feel free to post it in the chat or raise your hand if you'd like to be taken off the mic to ask it out loud. I'm also recording today's session, so later today or maybe tomorrow morning at the latest, you'll get a follow-up email with the link to the recording as well as any other links or resources that Evan discusses today. So without further ado, I am going to hand it off to Evan. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for the intro, Vanessa. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, you are sounding good.
Great, awesome. I'm coming to you live, appropriately enough, from sunny San Francisco, home of generative AI, where I'm here attending the AMIA conference. So it's appropriate that I'm speaking to you from San Francisco. And as Vanessa mentioned, I'll be talking to you today about the use of LLMs for clinical research at Weill Cornell. And as Vanessa also mentioned, my name is Evan Scholl. I'm the Associate Director of Data Science Services for Research Informatics within ITS. I'm also a lecturer in the Division of Health Informatics within PHS. Let's get started with our relatively uncontroversial contention, and I'm gonna make some controversial ones later on, or I'll try. I'll start with an uncontroversial one, which is that to do good research, you need good data. A lot of folks on this call have probably heard me say that before, even heard me open a presentation with that before, and there are all sorts of good reasons for this. We need to get drugs on the market. We need to pull drugs from the market. We need to figure out how best to treat patients. And we need to figure out how good of a job we're doing of providing equitable care to all patients. To do all this stuff, we need really good data, and we also need good data to take care of people properly, in order to support the decisions we're making at large scales, in order to allocate beds and ventilators, in order to pull drugs that might be hurting people from the market. We need to have really sort of reliable data. And for a long time, one of the biggest problems about this has been that getting reliable data is really reliably expensive. And there's a great study that came out of Johns Hopkins, the Bloomberg School of Public Health, that showed that for the period they looked at in 2015 to 2016, the average cost of a clinical trial was $19 million. Bringing drugs to market is really expensive, and this is because good data is expensive. Manual chart review traditionally is like how people are pulling data in the clinical research world, or manual collection. It's time consuming. It doesn't really scale. And even when you're sort of working with large observational data sets, there are data quality techniques that we can implement that can sort of mitigate some of the risk. But even those data sets are sort of fraught with their own issues. So it puts people in an awkward position where to get like sort of large scale reliable data requires these really expensive techniques, or using data that might not be perfect for the purpose you have in mind. Um, and this has sort of downstream knock-on effects, right? What this means is that the kinds of studies that really require massive statistical power to demonstrate some of these effects in big populations sometimes don't get done, because it's just too difficult and expensive to extract the data required to do the study. And so often there's no financial incentive to get it done, depressingly enough. Working with data at scale like really holds the potential to address some of these problems, and that's some of what we're going to be talking about today. So before we dive in, and I promise I'm going to get to like live demos and like here's the form and here's how you can get access. We will get to that point, and I will stop lecturing. But as I mentioned earlier, my job title is lecturer, so I'm obligated to do a little bit of it. Why is it so hard to get good data? Well, to talk about that, we have to talk a little bit about unstructured versus structured data. Good example of structured data is stuff that fits into an Excel spreadsheet, right? Anything that you can, do computation on, anything you can build a bar graph on top of, phone numbers, names, lab results, stuff like that. Unstructured data is things like pictures, notes, blobs of text, photos, anything like that. This is harder to collect and analyze. It's harder to work with, and it's harder to sort of bring order to it and derive insight from it. but it's often really, really important. And I'll give you a sort of a concrete example here. This is, a note for a patient who's being treated for breast cancer, and this patient has triple negative breast cancer, and that's a really pertinent, like important clinical observation. Based on that fact, this patient is going to, there are some clinical trials that this patient is going to be eligible for. There's others that they're not eligible for because they might be looking for patients who are estrogen receptor positive. There's no way to know that without sort of reading this note and digging it out. And I can tell you from personal experience that there are a million ways that physicians express this concept. It's not always triple negative breast cancer. It often is, but it often isn't. And now, if we contrast this to like a problem list or the list of diagnoses from a specific encounter, you can see that this is structured data, right? These are like rows and columns of the things that we know this patient is sick with. We can see even down here that this patient has the diagnosis code malignant neoplasm of overlapping sites of right breasted female estrogen receptor negative. So we can even sort of, infer some of the content of that, like, triple negative finding in the unstructured data from, looking at the structured data. And this is something that can be sort of, you can run computation on this. You can bring these codes into an algorithm and use that algorithm to search for all your patients who are estrogen receptor positive. Whereas with data like this, you can't sort of do that off the raw data. You have to process it a little bit. And this unstructured data is often some of the most critical data in biomedical research. The key findings that we really need in order to build predictive models that can predict the kinds of outcomes we care about, like progression in cancer patients, readmission, death, all of these things are like buried in the notes. They're buried in free text reports. And I know there are folks from the Department of Pathology and Laboratory Medicine on the call. Pathology is prone to this. All fields are. Some of the key things in pathology reports are buried in there. Radiology stuff too. There's these values that are really important, like a BI-RADS score from a mammogram. These are often sort of buried in free text. And even in regular outpatient medicine, these progress notes often contain critical information, and we'll see more examples of that in a little bit. And there's all sorts of just really nuggets of gold and critical clinical information buried in these free text notes within the electronic health record. Um, so to address this problem in clinical research, informatics folks and data science folks have built these natural language processing tools, and this is something that it's hard to talk about without sounding like an old fogey, but informatics folks have been doing this since 2004. This paper on the lower left here from Carol Friedman at Columbia was written when I was graduating high school in 2004. And this is a technique to encode structured data out of unstructured notes. And folks in informatics have been doing this for a long time. There's techniques like CTAKes and UEMA that have let us work with this data. And while folks were scaling this up, interest in the global community in these computational techniques to work with unstructured data was also really, really sort of scaling up. And in the late teens, and so we're going into 2020, the use of these sort of transformer-based technologies started to really ascend and really explode. And this is when you started to see some of the development around, commercial work. And I often compare this to like the part where you're going up the roller coaster. This is the King Ka at Six Flags in New Jersey. If anyone's ever seen it, it's closing soon. You should ride it if you want to. And on the way up, this technology was really sort of on the verge of explosion. And then December 2022, we all know, ChatGPT launched commercially, and this sort of brought a lot of attention globally to the potential of these techniques for working with data. So, this was a sea change for everything. And these techniques that previously had required folks to write code, learn Python to work with. All of a sudden, this technology was available to anyone, and you could just sort of go and register an account. I registered an account and went and did it. It was very sort of interesting and curious. And this chatbot functionality provides a very different lens into the world of like BERT and transformer models than what folks had previously, which again, I really want to stress required writing code for a long time. People were interacting with these models as sort of the output from a command line console, and ChatGPT really kind of changed that. And we'll go into the difference between interacting with these models through a commercial sort of service that serves as an intermediary like ChatGPT. We'll go into that in further detail. And like I said, by this point, by 2022, not to sound like a hipster, but we were, in informatics, we were doing this before it was cool. And these transformer tech-based techniques were already sort of under wide adoption. So since 2022, we've seen so much uptake and advancement in this field, and LLMs have just been sort of blazing a really crazy trail through the world of research, demonstrating techniques that, or demonstrating performance that, if not equal to human intelligence, certainly serves as a convincing facsimile thereof. These are tools that really sort of provide the illusion of a human who can answer these questions accurately. And they've demonstrated good performance on the USMLEs. They've demonstrated good performance on the MCATs. And they've demonstrated good performance across a broad array of other techniques. So I do see one question in the chat that I want to engage with. What does LLM stand for? It's a great question. So LLM stands for Large Language Model. So just to back up a few slides, during the development of these techniques like CTAKE, UEMA, this sort of seminal informatics work, people started sort of doing really convoluted and complex math with this data to create vector-based embeddings, where essentially the text and the strings of text and the groupings of the text are converted into numerical representations. And this technique turned into something called BERTs. And the BERT technique served as the genesis of these techniques that have now attracted a lot of publicity, where they're large language models. So LLM stands for large language models. It's right up there in the head here. And I can get into the underlying math of it a little bit more, although I do have to defer to folks who are experts in the underlying math of it, if we have to get into things that involve Greek letters. So LLMs have done really well, and by LLMs, I'm referring here to services like ChatGPT, and also things like Gemini from Google, Llama from Meta, and then some also sort of specialized medicine trained models. These models work by providing large amounts of data, and sort of analyzing all of the embeddings within those data. So some of those models are trained on medical data sets like MedLM, and some of those are the ones that have actually done particularly well on the USMLEs and on some of these other tasks. So yeah, we've seen that they can do a lot, and we've seen that they can be used to demonstrate sort of clinical understanding or represent clinical knowledge. And I would love now to sort of start to A, ask for questions, and B, turn to some of the use cases and show you some of the things that people can do with it and some of the things that people are sort of doing with it here at Weill Cornell. So before I start to shift towards how to access it and what folks are doing with it, do folks have any questions about the background? And you can feel free to drop them in the chat or take yourself off mute.
No questions on my end either, Evan. Oh wait, what the?
What the
Um,
LLM making things up? Yeah. So LLMs do hallucinate for sure. And we'll get into that a little bit. What about LLMs making things up? Yeah, absolutely. They hallucinate all the time, and I'm going to show you like a really good example of that I came up with while I was trying to show you guys some of the things that people can do with this. And I'm also going to show you some of the techniques that we use to try and mitigate that. And I really want to stress that like these are tools, just like any other tool, where you can't always trust the output. And just because they show the potential to do all these sorts of things doesn't mean that they don't need to be really rigorously evaluated. And some of the papers that I'm sort of showing you here demonstrate the ability of folks to ask those kinds of rigorous questions, like what about the LLM making things up? Well, if you give it the USMLEs and you grade it, you'll see if it's making stuff up, and you'll see based on its performance. The idea is that you create these objective yardsticks. And I'll show you some examples of what we're doing specifically in the area of adverse drug event detection, that speaks to that question specifically. Cool. All right, one more in the chat. Is it possible to have a tool scan medical records at Cornell to produce summaries or answer queries whether a patient meets certain criteria? What are the security implications? It's definitely possible to do something that sort of resembles what you're describing, and there are significant security implications, and that's what I plan on spending most of the next section of the presentation discussing. Cool. All right. So enough lecturing about the background. How can I start using it? Well, let's talk about what you want to do first. So if what you want to do is exploratory and initial, and you don't want to work with sensitive data, the good news is you can get started right now today, using Copilot, which you have access to through your WCM O365 subscription. Folks also are free to go use the commercial products, using their own, by paying their own money or using their own services. I just really need to stress extensively that any sort of sensitive data, and we'll go in specific detail about what defines sensitive data, needs to be worked with within a different environment than this. You can't, and I'll go into that in much more detail. Copilot and these commercial services are only for sort of exploratory work without any WCM sensitive data. And that said, there's still a decent amount that can be done with them. And I want to sort of try and show you some concrete examples here. So there's, R scripts. Copilot is really, really good at sort of teaching you how to do R, or how to write R or Python. So here's an example of me using Copilot to try and, help me with my research. I'm not using Copilot to actually analyze large data sets. I'm using Copilot to show me how to write code that analyzes large data sets. But let's go into sort of some other specific examples. So I'll go back to this slide in a moment. But because we got a question about hallucinations, I want to start with this example, which showcased actually a really good example of hallucination. So this is me sort of going into Copilot, and saying, this paper is really long and I don't understand the gist of it. Can you summarize it? So we get the response here and we see, sure, I can help with that. I got this really nice sort of cheerful, well phrased response with a decent summary of a paper about the cardiovascular side effects of COVID-19 vaccination. And this looks pretty good. And I'd even suggest some follow-up questions. We can say, what are the specific cardiovascular manifestations? And it gives me an example. Let's go back and see. This looks pretty convincing, right? Let's go back and read the paper and see what we see here. Oop, there we go. Oh, spoiler alert. Here it is. It's a different paper. Summarized the wrong paper for me. So, this is a pretty decent example of something that may have initially looked convincing, but in this case was sort of very confidently wrong, and very confidently and kind of dangerously and irrelevantly wrong. So it's important to sort of check the output. And I have no doubt that if this were a paper that were posted on PubMed Central for free, rather than just the abstract, I may have been able to feed it the URL of the full text. Maybe it would have performed differently. I don't know. There's all sorts of ways that we could, test this out and refine it and maybe fix it. You could probably even argue with the model as if it were a person and say, no, you're wrong. That paper is, about the Legend T2DM study. And it might say, I'm sorry, and try and fix it. But to trust the first pass output is a dangerous thing for sure. I just want to loop back a little bit. Sorry, I was talking about hallucinations because we did get the question there. But I want to loop back a little bit to talk about the definition of sensitive data. And this is really important. And if there's sort of one thing you take away from this, it's I would love for it to be that you need to work within an ITS approved platform and not one of these tools if you're working with sensitive data. So anything obviously with PHI, anything with patient data, free text notes especially, but even like an Excel spreadsheet with MRNs, obviously that is like the highest class of high risk data. But even data sets that are sort of de-identified, especially if they're de-identified, by your own lab or without approval from central like WCM or ITS authority, those still constitute like moderate risk data sets. And loading them into one of these platforms or using one of these platforms to analyze data from there could constitute a HIPAA breach. And I really need to sort of try and impress upon all of you that these tools that I'm showing you here, like Copilot, and any of the commercial generative AI tools, can't be used with sensitive data for WCM research. This should only really be used for stuff like what I'm showing you here. And even then, there are some sort of pitfalls that you can run into. So ITS has and the college and the Department of Policy have provided sort of detailed guidance on what constitutes sensitive data. It can be a little confusing and it can be hard to sort of wrangle whether a specific definition is sensitive. We're always available to help, and you can contact me or arch-support. And yes, this recording will be sent to attendees. I'm going to put my this email address in the chat also. You can always contact arch-support@med.cornell.edu if you have specific questions about whether a data set is what, sort of what level of risk it is. We can help with that determination. So we went over some of the critical things to keep in mind here. We went over the most important thing, which is not using sensitive data. We also went over briefly hallucinations and the importance of not sort of blindly trusting the output of these models. The other thing that I really want to stress here is that if you're not writing code, you're not directly interacting with the model. And I want to give you sort of an example of that. This is within the biostats division in PHS, we have a hot dog eating contest every year. And there's a flyer that they produced. It was actually, I thought, a very attractive and beautiful flyer. And I wanted to see if Copilot had any thoughts on how we could make it prettier. So I uploaded this in, and it actually sort of gave me a few pretty good suggestions here. I don't know if any of these would actually work to make it nicer. But clearly Copilot was able to sort of understand the PDF that I uploaded and sort of make suggestions about it. And you can see it even was able to do some ASCII art demonstrating how it thinks we could sort of spiff it up a little bit. Um, this is hard, and doing this is really sort of challenging. And if you think about computationally what's going on under the hood here, there's a lot happening. This PDF has to be sort of fed to a separate model that can do sort of vision, that can analyze like a picture. And then the text that I'm feeding it has to also be fed as text. And then those responses and the responses from those individual models have to be stitched together. And then it has to sort of cohere and provide a unified response that correlates the text and the vision. That's really difficult and that's really hard. And a lot of people who are a lot smarter than I am had to write a lot of code to make that happen and to make Copilot do this. Similarly, ChatGPT has functionality where you can just like upload an Excel spreadsheet and say, build me a graph that shows the distribution of average speed among all these cars, and it's really wild. And in order for that to happen, there's a lot going on behind the scenes. These tools are, like ducks or swans. They look graceful, and underneath the surface, there's a lot of frantic paddling required to make this kind of stuff happen. So if we think about sort of doing this stuff on a one-by-one basis, a commercial tool like this is a really great fit. But if we start to think about how we can scale this up and scale this out, it starts to get a little trickier. And when we have to start to think about, ways to write code to maybe replicate some of that functionality. So if like we wanted to process, a million spreadsheets or build a pipeline to process a bunch of spreadsheets one at a time, you might have to, write code to replicate some of the functionality that this sort of commercial chatbot is designed to do one at a time for an end user who's just doing it, once every so often. And sometimes research cases sort of go beyond that pretty quickly. Um, so those are sort of some of the examples of how we would suggest that folks use the commercial LLM services, Copilot, to assist with research. It's really, because of the limitations around sensitive data, most of the heavy lifting has to occur in other areas. But, this does have a lot of potential for, use and sort of formatting suggestions. Grammar, it's really good at, fixing grammar or, rewriting things. If you're working on academic output or writing a paper, I think there's a lot of papers that are, getting a pass through with ChatGPT or Copilot for grammar these days. But really for anything where you're working with sensitive data, I do have to really sort of, again, brandish the data classification and suggest that folks who want to work with that go through some of the other tools that we have. What if you do need to work with sensitive data? And a lot of folks do, and a lot of folks are, and that's mostly sort of what I'm most excited to talk to you about today is how you can do this and what folks are doing with it right now here at Cornell. So there are two sort of main cloud platforms that we're sort of supporting right now for working with sensitive data. One is GCP and one is AWS. I will say that the trail is more thoroughly blazed with GCP, and most of what I'm going to talk to you about today happened in GCP. Most of the work that I do personally with LLMs is in GCP. That said, we're sort of rapidly scaling up our AWS deployment, and we sort of hope to be able to make this available within the coming weeks. That said, I will be talking mostly about GCP today, but we can support work in both of these environments. So the main way to sort of work securely within the WCM environment with LLMs today is using what Google calls its Vertex AI platform. And Vertex AI is a really cool tool. It's a really cool platform that lets you sort of do a bunch of different things with AI models, at scale. And what you can do ranges from stuff that's not that different from what I showed you earlier with Copilot, all the way to stuff that costs thousands of dollars and involves, setting up a production web server that can receive thousands of requests a minute and return, customized results based on a fine-tuned model. And all that stuff is accessed through the browser on the left, and you can sort of familiarize yourself with this and run whatever you need to do within this environment. The funding here goes to your department. Folks who want to work with this do have to provide a fund number, and there are costs associated with the service. The costs are sometimes hard to predict, and they really depend on what you're doing. If you're running pipelines on notes that are measured in the thousands or the hundreds, we've had a hard time racking up more than a few $100s or a couple $1,000s at max. If what you're doing involves deploying large models like to production endpoints, that can cost thousands of dollars. So it really sort of depends on the specifics of what you're trying to do. I will say that it's hard to rack up a big bill without knowing a little bit of code, or without knowing a little bit about what you're doing. Um, so this serves as sort of the landing ground, and to get access to one of these platforms and to get started and to get if you have a fund number ready and waiting or your PI does, this is the form that you have to submit. And as Vanessa said, I think in the chat, we will be distributing the slides to the attendees. And this is a live hyperlink, so you can open this slide deck in PowerPoint and you can click on that link and you'll be taken directly to the request form. And this is sort of an intake form. We'll probably schedule a meeting or a consult with you to figure out exactly what it is you want to do. And then we can get the process started of collecting your billing details and setting up the environment. So this is how you can get started. And if folks do want to come away from this presentation wanting to do this kind of work with sensitive data, this is the link you need to click to make that happen. So using these workspaces, there's an awful lot that you can do. You can interact directly with the models, as I said. You can also sort of run some scripts that analyze data at scale. And then you can deploy production models to endpoints. And I see we have a question in the chat. Oh, no, okay. So I would like now to transition to a live demo of that so I can show you a little bit more of what I mean. I'm going to try and unpause my share here in just a moment. All right. Okay. So folks should be able to see my Vertex AI console now, and I'm going to show you sort of a little bit of what I meant. So we're sort of landed here on the basic landing page, and there are a couple of things I want to illustrate. One is the sort of basic area to sort of work directly with models. This is sort of the equivalent of the commercial Gemini or the commercial rather Copilot service, where you can sort of directly test out a prompt and sort of see what you can do with the data. And this is really good for sort of initial exploratory work. It is hard. I don't have any of the other companies' models deployed right now. The default options here are mostly Gemini and MedPalm, which is Google's specifically trained medical model. But you can sort of pick which model you're interacting with. If I go over to Freeform here, I can actually get the MedLM models unlocked as well. But I'll just sort of go with Gemini Flash right now, which is Google's stock model. It's sort of reasonably well performing. And to sort of show you guys what what you can do and how this works, I do have a sample de-identified patient note that I was able to get from a certified source here. And I'm going to sort of show you guys a little bit of the note and show you guys some of sort of what you can do with this. So this is a pretty good example of like a post-op follow-up note. You can see here there's a lot of information buried in this note, and if folks on the call are clinicians, you may this may look relatively familiar to you. If you've ever done chart review, this may look familiar to you. There's a lot of information in here, some of it relevant, some of it not. You can imagine what a pain in the butt it would be to try and read through 100 of these, or 1,000, or 100,000, or 1,000,000, and try and pick out, which of them had a mention of, lower extremity edema R to L, or whatever other, concept is sort of buried in here. So using LLMs, we can sort of start to bring order to this, and I'll sort of show you what I mean. We can go in. We can write a prompt and we can say, what are the most pertinent conditions observed in this note? Just gonna copy it right in and we will get output. And you can see here, there's some there's some stuff that pops out. You can definitely sort of ask it, direct questions about sensitive data. And when we first started doing work with LLMs here at Cornell, I will shout out, I don't know if anyone from Dr. Greenspan's lab is here in the audience, but Dr. Zach Greenspan was sort of one of the pioneers of working with LLMs on sensitive EHR data at Cornell. And this is some of the first things that I think Dr. Greenspan and I were trying out, was just basic things of dropping in a note and saying, what is this patient a good candidate for surgery? What are the basic characteristics, just to see if the output is sort of trustworthy, and to start to sort of scale up and scale out what other tasks we might want the machine to do. You can imagine that if what you have is 5,000 patients and you want to know how many of them had an adverse drug reaction to valproic acid. You could sort of test this out on one or two of them, and once you have a prompt that you're confident sort of does what you're looking to do, you could then sort of turn your attention to another approach, and start to do that at scale. So this is, like I said, mostly for use and just in sort of setting the parameters of your model and interacting with it through a web client so that you can then figure out what you want to do at a larger scale. So using these techniques, you can, like I said, sort of save your prompts. You can, there's also a prompt gallery and a prompt management system that you can use to sort of save these prompts. So once you've done something, you don't have to just save it as a TXT file. As you'll see a little bit later on, I'm not always good about that. I often save my prompts as TXT files. But there is, also the option within Vertex AI to sort of save these prompts. And then work with them on a more structured basis. You can also compare the performance of them once you've got them evaluated. And all of this is really cool and it's good, and it's still not writing any code. And you may have heard me mention earlier, the contention that to do this properly you need to write a little bit of code. So where do you write code? Well, you write code in the workbench for the most part. Jupyter Notebook is a strategy that folks should be familiar with. A lot of folks have probably already been exposed to Jupyter Notebook or this structure of working with code. I personally learned how to use R in grad school. I'm not much of a Python coder. I actually often use Gemini to write Python code for me or to edit other people's Python code, which is a little bit of a vertiginous feeling or a meta recursive feeling. But this is sort of how we can deploy these models at scale, and start to run these prompts iteratively across thousands of notes, or to do large scale analysis of EHR data using large language models. And this is sort of a concrete example of one of the instances where we're doing this. And I'll sort of go into more detail on this, but folks who are familiar with Python or good at writing code may sort of be able to see what's going on here. We are essentially reading in a predefined prompt that we got from our collaborators, and running it on a sample of patients, and trying to extract smoking status for those patients. Whether the patient smokes pipes or does chewing tobacco or quit smoking 10 years ago. So this code is essentially setting all the parameters for our sort of local region and the project we're working with. It's defining a function using the Gemini 1.0 Pro model, setting the project, and then it's setting the thresholds for blocking harmful content and the responses, and ultimately sort of running that iteratively always over a series of notes that we in this case had uploaded as TXT files. And you can see here there's, a couple hundred notes in the output. So, putting these in, sort of one by one is not really practical. And putting into the prompt window one by one would probably take a really long time. And some people do that. I will say I reviewed a paper for a journal the other day where the submitters had done exactly that. They had sort of gone into ChatGPT and copy pasted notes one by one, and then manually tabulated the results in Excel. And it is doable, but it's not really sort of how you're supposed to use these tools, and it's not the easiest way to do them at scale. So you can see here we then are sort of looking at the output and printing out, one of the notes, and it's saying, here's what it thinks. We think this patient is a current smoker. We have an zero point 0.8 confidence score in that, and the relevant evidence is the phrase "the patient currently smokes." So then, once you've done that, you can sort of write out the results of all of your findings. And in this case, what we were able to do is say for each of the notes in the sample, what is the smoking status, and then what's the confidence score for that value, and then what's the relevant evidence that was extracted, so on and so forth. Um, so this is most of what we've been doing today with LLMs, and most of what we've been doing with EHR data and LLMs specifically involves sort of working with the models in this way, and working with them from a Jupyter Notebook console. And I see the worry in the chat here about sort of unpredictable costing of GPUs or of GCP. And I will say, if you're just doing this and you're just working with the Gemini models with limited data sets, it's really hard to run up a bill. And we've this project that I have here. I have a billing alert set here to go off when we hit $3,000 in billing. And I have an alert set configured to send me emails at 25, 50, and 75%. We can configure emails like that. And I haven't even gone over the 25% threshold on this project yet, because we've used it to analyze, a few thousand notes. There are other projects where we've gone over that, where we've incurred, as much as $5,000 or $6,000 in costs. Those are projects where we've brought in large models from other folks, like the Llama 405B model, and then deployed it to a production endpoint to start like receiving requests programmatically. So, doing the cost, we can definitely provide you a cost estimate by showing you similar projects that we've done, and sort of scaling, scoping what you want to do and saying, okay, well, do you want to look at 10,000 notes? Do you want to look at a million notes, or do you want to look at 100 notes? And using that information is probably going to be the best way for us to provide you an orders of magnitude estimate of cost. And there are plenty of folks in ITS who are very, very happy to sit down with you and sort of scope out your project and try and give you a sense of how much it's going to cost. What we can also do, and this is what I do for my own projects, is we can also put hard limits in place such that your project is capped at a certain amount of expense. And if you try to do anything that goes above that limit, it will fail, and instead you'll get an error email saying what you're trying to do costs more money than you're willing to spend. I see another question in the chat about using WMHPC to reduce cloud cost. Yes, absolutely. So there are for sure ways to use GPUs to run LLMs on the local HPC cluster. And we have folks who are doing that today. Yifan Pang in my division is actually here with me in San Francisco and AMIA, talking, presenting a lot of the work that he's done doing exactly that. For folks who are sort of capable of like submitting jobs to Slurm clusters and working with GPUs and like installing their own models, I would say that we'd probably want to talk to you and see what you want to do before deciding whether it's more cost effective to get you on our on-prem HPC cluster or working within GCP or AWS. GCP has been sort of a good partner to work with, and they're very eager to collaborate, and in many cases may be willing to provide credits or promotional pricing rates that could make it perhaps comparable to the cost of doing it on-prem with HPC. So For sure, worthy considerations to take into account. But most of the work we've been focusing on supporting within the clinical research community. It's been easier to sort of spin folks up within a GCP project, as opposed to getting folks learning how to use Slurm and HPC clusters and submitting jobs to nodes and so on and so forth. Um, I hope that answers your question, Ikram. So. Any other questions before I move on with the demo? No. Okay, cool. Here's another example that gets a little bit more into the clinical details of stuff. This is a project that we've been working on with a few folks, Dr. Leonard from the lymphoma group and Dr. Elemento from the Englander Institute, who's really sort of driven a lot of LLM research. I want to tip the hat to Dr. Elemento's particularly. And this is a project where we're trying to find patients who had adverse drug reactions. Specifically, there's like a cohort of patients who were on a clinical trial that actually got written up in the New England Journal of Medicine for mantle cell lymphoma. And this trial involved two drugs, lenalidomide and rituximab, both of which are nasty drugs. And to be fair, they're not as nasty as mantle cell lymphoma, which is why people take them. But sometimes they do give you things like sinusitis, fever, cough, diarrhea, constipation, and all the other lovely events that you see written out on your screen here. So as part of the clinical trial, folks, and you may remember me earlier talking about the time and expense of manual adjudication, research coordinators extracted whether or not these patients had these adverse events manually on a patient by patient basis. So we had a REDCap project with all of that data sitting there as a beautiful gold standard. And we wanted to see if we could use LLMs to sort of obviate the need for that chart review. We wanted to see if LLMs could sort of extract from the notes whether or not the patient had the specific adverse drug event. So we gave it this prompt, suggesting that the output should come out in the form of a JSON object. A lot of this work ends up being coercing the model to output things in the right format so that you can stitch it together and compare it to your gold standard. Um, but this is sort of what we asked it to do, and it iterated through all of these different notes, and then for each of these patients, produced an annotation of whether or not it thought that patient expressed that ADE in the note. And we were able to go through all of the notes and all of the results from all of this, and then spit it out into a CSV file at the very end. And I can't show you the actual contents because it's sensitive data with patient notes. And I have to add you all to the IRB protocol. But we're now sort of working on comparing the results of these annotations to the REDCap data to see how good of a job the LLM is doing. And I wanted to get to some of the questions we had earlier about like how you can trust the output and like the importance of evaluating this. Like it is really important, and you can't blindly trust the output. And I see it was Dr. Toman who asked that question. Sometimes the LLM does make stuff up, so we need to run code like this, and we need to do robust statistical analysis of its output in order to ensure that it can be trusted and that it's accurate and that it's actually pulling what we expect it to pull. And that's why I think I want to go back again briefly to the slide where I said that if you're not writing code, you're not really interacting with the model. This is a really good example. If I wanted this, code to also see PDFs with like scanned in notes from another part, like I would have to write a lot of code to make that happen, and sort of stitch it together, and then ensure that the LLM knew how to associate, each document with each patient in the appropriate way, and all of that requires some sort of trial and error process. Jupyter Notebook, again, sort of the gold standard in this stuff, and really sort of how we're doing a lot of this work and how we're structuring a lot of the work with sensitive data within this environment. Just to sort of go over some of the other things, we talked about the freeform and chat areas where you can interact with the models ad hoc and test out prompts. I also want to talk a little bit about the model garden. So within GCP, we can also sort of deploy models from other providers, including, I mentioned earlier, Meta and Claude. You can bring this in. This is a little trickier. I mean, this can sometimes get expensive. So for example, like if I were to go in and go to Llama 3.1 and pick their biggest, most expensive version of Llama, which is the one that was trained on 405 billion different parameters. that might be expensive. And deploying that to an endpoint, by clicking through all this stuff, and that can be expensive. And they tell you the sort of the pricing here. But this is where you sort of run into the potential to maybe get a little bit more cost here. Like, let's say that you find that Gemini isn't doing as well as you think it should be on a specific task, and you're convinced that one of the models from Mistral or Anthropic would perform better. That's the situation where you would consider deploying some of these. So for some of the folks earlier, I heard expressing concerns about cost. I would say that, like, if you have a really specific use case in mind that requires like a big expensive model and running it across thousands of nodes, then yeah, you probably should be budgeting accordingly. But if what you want to do is relatively confined, doesn't require the use of like one specific model, and can be run over tens or thousands of documents, then your cost is likely to be measured in numbers that have like either 3 or 4 digits. So I hope that helps people get a sense of sort of what the overall cost is likely to be. And again, we're really happy to work with folks to sort of scope out the project and get a sense of what you're trying to do and how much it's likely to cost and what the most effective way for us to make it happen is. So a little bit more about some of the other projects that are sort of actively going on at Cornell right now. In addition to this ADE detection project right now, we're also working with Dr. Alimento on another project with a cohort of 239 glioblastoma patients who, again, have beautiful data annotated in REDCap. And this is some of the data that I was talking about earlier, in terms of pathology, immunohistochemistries, T&M staging, microanatomic features. All of this stuff was manually annotated by research coordinators, who spent a lot of time bringing the data in. And the this is our gold standard, and we're training the LLMs to try and reproduce the output of this annotation process. So I do see a really interesting question in the chat, which is, how do you know? Oh, I'm sorry, that wasn't a direct. That was a DM, not a direct, not an open question. I'll address that separately with the person who sent it to me via DM. Apologies. Or if you intended that to be a message for everyone, please feel free to post it again as a message for everyone. Sorry, a little bit more about that use case. So we are finding also some interesting things in this cancer data extraction project. Data first diagnosis, which is a notoriously sticky concept in the EHR for cancer patients. We are actually able to get that out pretty well. This is tough because patients come to us having received cancer treatment at other centers. And often, there'll be a phrase in the notes saying, patient first diagnosed with breast cancer in 1991 in Connecticut, now coming back 18 years later because it's recurred. This is a hard concept to extract, and we've been able to pull that out with pretty decent performance, although some other techniques are harder to get. I also want to really call out the Department of Pediatrics, and specifically Dr. Zach Grinspan, who's really sort of led a lot of work in this area. Dr. Grinspan has been piloting a lot of this work, identifying surgical candidates in patients with epilepsy, summarizing their seizure trajectories, and doing just sort of a lot more work in peds more broadly. And then I also want to call out the MPN group, as well, led by Dr. Scandura in the Richard Silver MPN Center. They're scaling up use of GCP to extract data elements from patients with liquid tumors, and specifically looking at like bone marrow biopsy reports and getting a lot of the really critical data out there with large language models. Um, so I do see that the person who DM'd me the question, I think, did intend for it to be asked for everyone. So I'm going to read the question out loud and then I will answer it. So the question was, how do you know that this data is being protected? I know there's been conversations around Meta working with law enforcement to prosecute women for having abortions, and similar situations with Amazon. And it's a really good question, and we've been thinking about this really carefully. And this is the answer to that question is the reason why I've been so insistent and such a stick in the mud about this slide, about the slide not to use sensitive data, which is that we're confident that our BAA, our business associate agreement, with Google and with Amazon is such that our data that we're feeding to these models is not being passed on to any other products or used or incorporated in anything else. In other words, like when we do this, it's being run on like a cordoned off, secured instance where the prompts that we feed it are not getting reincorporated into any training data. So the data can be safely used with the confidence that, we're not, we're essentially just processing it as if we were doing it on our laptops, rather than having it, entered into a larger repository. Um, Microsoft, we're not able to confidently make that assertion yet, and we hope to do that soon. And our lawyers are actively engaged in conversations with Microsoft's lawyers about like how the legal agreement needs to be structured for us to have that degree of confidence. But it's not there yet. And this is part of why I mentioned earlier that it can get expensive to do this. So the person who asked this question also specifically called out Meta, who provides the Llama models. And if you go to Meta and use their services directly, there is the risk that your data might be sort of incorporated into their training models. But when you're deploying Llama in GCP, what you're actually doing is downloading like an image of the weights and the embeddings, all those sort of numerical representations of the text from all the 405 billion tokens it was trained on, and then loading that into a private sort of Google Cloud instance on a virtual machine where you can be confident that you're controlling everything that's coming into and out of it. So that's part of why it's expensive to do that, because we're doing it securely and because we're not engaged in this commercial trade-off where the use of these commercial services entail, which is that whatever data you provide to them is fair game for them to use to train the models. And that's part of why, I can't in good conscience tell you to go and use Microsoft Copilot for sensitive data, because everything I put in here, this flyer, this hot dog eating contest flyer that I uploaded, is now the property of Microsoft and can be used for probably whatever they want to use it for. Another great question from Spencer, no surprise there. Is it possible to import a non-commercial LLM into the model garden? Yes, absolutely. You can deploy from Hugging Face. You can upload Docker containers. Anything on GitHub or Hugging Face can be brought in to the model garden, and there are definitely ways to. I think just give it a Hugging Face URL directly. Yeah, the deploy from Hugging Face. That's usually the easiest way to do it. This is also an area where, you run the potential to incur costs and ITS can provide guidance in how to deploy models like that, in a way that hopefully won't run up quintuple digit bills. I'm going to turn back to my slides for a moment. See. There's one more thing I just wanted to talk about a little bit before I open it up to questions overall, and it's retrieval augmented generation. This is another technique that's attracting a lot of attention these days. And I apologize, I don't have a demo ready to pull up now. But retrieval augmented generation solves or attempts to solve a problem that's common with the use of LLMs, which is that these LLMs are trained on like a broad base of documents. And because that base of documents is so broad, it doesn't always know which ones are most relevant to the question you're asking. So RAGs are ways to get around that problem by giving the LLM the documents that you care about so that you can ask questions about those documents. And I'll give you an example here. Like you can, for example, take PDFs of every note ever entered into a patient's EHR, along with all the other PDFs that were sort of scanned in for them, their CT scans and lab results, and sort of put that into a RAG, and then you can start asking the LLM questions like, what are the genetic variants present in the patients, from these documents, and it'll infer from your question that these documents refers to the training corpus that you created, and then answer accordingly. And this lets you do some really, really cool things. You can think here about like uploading, little text files with, information about, clinical trial candidates or whatever. You can really start to sort of ask the language model using RAG. You can ask the language model questions about your data set, and get answers back, without having to do things like iteratively apply a prompt over 10,000 rows of data, which is what I was showing in the Jupyter notebook before. Um, so most of what we've been doing with RAG so far has been in the form of other Jupyter notebooks where we're sort of creating this and trying to understand what it actually does. And folks on the call are sort of welcome to join us in that. If you have a research project with IRB approval and funding, we're happy to sort of showcase what we've done on that front, and sort of hand the keys to you to continue iterating on it. At some point in the future, it's not at all unlikely that this RAG technique will be deployed in a more structured fashion, in a more sort of code-free fashion, to allow people to just sort of drag and drop the documents or corpus that you wanted to look at, and then start answering questions or start asking questions right away. So. Just a few shout outs. I know I'm going to forget a million people here, and apologize in advance to anyone I may have neglected. A lot of folks on the ITS side involved in making this service happen. Eddie Lee, for sure. Moitali, Chris, everyone on the Research Informatics data and software engineering team for populating EHR data into GCP. Jason Tavares from the OSPM. A lot of folks working to make this happen. So. Any questions? And again, we can dump these in the chat, or feel free to take yourself off mute. All right, great question from Kazi. In terms of results, are LLMs trained on medical data outperforming older methods used in the domain that have been fine-tuned over many years to take advantage? Yeah, that's a great question. So in some cases they are, and in other cases they aren't. And there's a lot of literature on this right now. I would encourage folks who are really interested in that to read specifically the JMIA special issue on ChatGPT and large language models in clinical research. This was JMIA is the journal of the American Medical Informatics Association. That's the conference I'm attending right now in San Francisco. I actually went to the editorial board meeting last night, and this issue has a bunch of articles where people tried to answer exactly that question, and they found differing results in differing domains. So it really sort of depends on what task you're talking about. In some tasks, like these basic, like non-LLM based approach, like a regular expression based approach, sometimes does better. And in other tasks, we see LLMs outperforming these tools that were previously sort of like the best of breed. So going back to that adverse drug event detection project, one of the things that we're doing with Dr. Elemento is comparing the results of the LLM with the results of this burger smoke ADE detection, which is not actually a delicious burger, but in fact, a state-of-the-art ADE detection technique that Scott Duvall and Olga Patterson in Utah came up with. So we're evaluating the performance of the LLM essentially against these other techniques, and we're finding sort of mixed. Our findings are mixed. For some of the adverse drug events, the LLM does better, and in other cases, the old approach does better. So it really depends. But yeah, I'll put the link to that JMS special issue in the chat, because it depends on the use case. Actually, that issue may have not come out yet. I'll double check. Another question. Are there general resources we could read to be more knowledgeable on this topic? Absolutely. So LinkedIn Learning is always sort of where I encourage folks to go first. LinkedIn Learning is a great resource for this, and some of the courses on NLP there would be a good like sort of precursor. That said, like I think part of the best way to learn is by doing. I also think that some of the challenges on Kaggle are a good example of how folks can start getting their hands wet with these tools. Great question in the chat about potential bias. What about potential bias coming from these models? We're working on patient data, e.g. gender bias. That's a really hot topic at the conference right here, right now. And Dr. Imon Banerjee from Stanford has published a lot of really interesting work on exactly that topic. And it's shown a lot of really frightening and sort of unsettling things. For example, if you ask these models to, draw me a picture of a doctor, it'll give you someone with a certain set of demographic characteristics. And if you ask it to draw me a picture of a nurse, it'll give you someone with a very, very different set of demographic characteristics. So there are a lot of ways that people are thinking about how to try and remedy that problem right now, and a lot of them involve really, really complicated math, and involve training the models differently, and essentially presenting the model an outcome in question, like readmission or whatever, and also these sort of confounder variables like gender or race that that could result in bias, and then sort of teasing out the impact that it's playing. But this is why it's important to write code, and this is why it's important to not blindly trust the output of the model, and this is why it's important to evaluate what you're doing against a gold standard and make sure that the output of these tools is actually, anchored to reality. I keep on going back to that example I looked at earlier where I gave it a PubMed link and it gave me this really confident summary that was just completely not anchored in reality. So I would say that potential bias is for sure a risk, and that the one of the ways that we can mitigate it is by doing really structured evaluation of the output of the model to ensure that that's either that A, that's not happening, or B, if it is, it's being taken into account and corrected for. I hope that answers your question.
We're out of time. If there are more questions, what I can recommend is when I send out the follow-up email with a link to the recording and all of the other resources that we talked about today, please feel free to just reply, and hopefully we can answer any questions where maybe you haven't thought of them right now, but as you're using and learning more about these tools, they come up. And certainly we'll do our best to answer any questions and help how we can. For anybody who signed in late, we will be sending a copy of the recording to everyone later. Evan's going to send me a copy of the slides, and I'll make sure that everyone gets the information we've talked about today. Thank you guys so much for spending time learning about this today. And a big thank you to Evan for facilitating this from across the country. Really, really appreciate you doing this.
My
We know you're
pleasure.
super busy. But everyone have a great rest of the day and hope to see you at another Tech Tuesday. Have a good one.
Thanks so much, everyone. Take care.